All right, crash course on endangered species, really quick. A species becomes endangered through a bunch of ways that we're already familiar with. Poaching is the most probably drastic way or most visible way. So, poachers will hunt for exotic species, and we can also potentially cause a species to become endangered when we overharvest it for food. Oh, I should mention the wild pet trade. Don't buy pets that are classified as wild. So be very careful about this one. We can definitely, there's some illegal websites that sell exotic pets that are not supposed to be sold in the US. So be aware of that. We have already talked about how certain species are more likely to become endangered, especially if they are specialists, because they have very specific food or habitat needs. And if those start to disappear, then they have the potential to become endangered. These specialists might also be less tolerant. They might have a smaller range of tolerance to certain types of things. And so a changing climate and a changing world might not benefit these specialists and might cause them to become endangered. Invasives, we just talked a bunch about. They can outcompete natives for resources and food. So zebra mussels is a really good example of that, of endangering a lot of native mussel species. And climate change is going to shift the habitats of a lot of different species. So remember, a species can adapt, move, tolerate, or die certain changes to its habitat and the things that are happening there. And specialist species might have trouble with some of these things. They might have trouble with the adapting or the tolerating. Okay, protecting endangered species. Poaching prevention is very visible, as I said before. So, hiring people to physically protect and endangered species and prevent poaching. We've done this with rhinos and elephants specifically. You can also enact laws that make poaching a really, really serious crime. Ways to protect the habitat, because if you protect the habitat of these species, they're more likely to survive. We've talked about connecting things with corridors, connecting these kind of no-go zones, wildlife preserves with corridors to prevent these species from being stuck in a specific area. You can also prevent the hunting or development of certain areas, the fragmentation, so preventing building of roads or preventing deforestation to help kind of preserve these habitats of these species. And there are two pieces of legislation that you also need to know. One is CITES, it's an international agreement for countries that enabled agencies to monitor endangered species. So this is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So that has been super important in protecting things. And the other is the Full-on Endangered Species Act. This is specific to the US. It's a national law that gives the US Fish and Wildlife Service the power to help to designate basically a species as endangered or threatened. And then once they have that designation, the US can monitor that species more. So here are the different IUCN, the different IUCN lists. So here are the different categories in the IUCN Red List. The ones that we start to pay attention to are the threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critical. And then obviously extinct and wild means that there are no populations that are left breeding in the wild, but it might still be around in zoos or have protected populations. And then fully extinct obviously is a species that is no longer on Earth. So here are the different categories on the IUCN Red List. Least concern means that the species is widespread and is not currently threatened. When we get near threatened, that means that we're tracking trends in the species that are causing us to think that it might be threatened in the very near future. Then we've got the vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered threatened groups, which have a high risk of extinction very soon. Extinct in the wild means that that species might still have some members of the population that are alive in zoos, but it no longer has any wild members of the population left. And then extinct, obviously, is no longer on the earth, living on the earth. So by taxon, we've got variations in the levels for these things. 41% of amphibians are endangered right now. They are especially vulnerable because they have part of their life in water and part on land, and they have really highly permeable skin, so they absorb different pollutants through their skin, which can cause major problems. Mammals are at 25%. Birds are at 13%. Warm water corals are not doing very well. They're at 33%. This obviously is because of changes to the ocean based on the ocean temperature and the increase in acidity. So that's not good for coral. And conifers are not doing great either. They're at 34%. That's a lot of things related to disease and expanding pest ranges and also invasive species that are targeting the conifers. And coniferous forests are especially troubling that they are so endangered because they sequester much more CO2 than temperate or tropical forests. As we've talked about before, specialists have a much higher chance of becoming endangered because they are less able to adapt to these new things. They're less able to move around, and they often have really limited food sources, versus generalists are much less likely to become endangered because of their ability to move around and their ability to kind of change their food sources if they need to. Competition. So, kind of a case study looking at competition and how that can play into endangerment is looking at these two different species of salamander. So, we've got the Shenandoah salamander, which is an endangered species and it's really limited in its range. And specifically, this is because of the red backed salamander, which is a very aggressive territorial salamander who is preventing the Shenandoah salamander from being able to access more different parts of its habitat. The redback salamander is doing fine, so it's least concern, but it's going to guard its rock habitats. So if there's potential issues with the climate that would make it so that the Shenandoah salamander had to move, they might be limited in that because of the redback salamander. So this is interspecific competition. This is competition between two different species, and that can be for food or resources or nest sites or water. And this can cause a species to become threatened, or what usually happens is that a species is already struggling and competition can make that worse. The last thing you need to know, and I apologize, I know this has been a long video. The last thing you need to know, though, is this acronym HIPCO, which are the primary drivers of species becoming threatened or endangered. First reason is habitat fragmentation and loss. Three specific examples are deforestation, wetland draining, and rivers kind of disappearing because of dams. So, river water on one side tends to increase, which you lose the land habitat on that side, and river waters tend to decrease majorly, and so you lose the riparian habitat on the other side of the river. The I stands for invasive species, which often outcompete native species or can really devastate native species if they're using them for food. The third is population growth of humans. This is kind of a driver of a lot of these different things, especially the habitat fragmentation and loss, because as humans increase their population size, they need a lot more space. Pollution or pollutants is the fourth one. Oil spills, pesticides, herbicides, all of these different types of things are impacting a lot of species. Specifically, endocrine disruptors and amphibians are a particular problem. Climate change is the C. This is shifting a lot of temperature and precipitation around the globe, which is going to change kind of what species are going to be able to handle in their specific areas isn't necessarily going to match up with their habitat anymore. So this is going to lead to potentially some massive migrations if species are able to do so, potentially adaptations if they're able to do so, or potentially species becoming endangered and extinct. And the last is overexploitation, which essentially just means a lot of hunting or poaching. If we're taking these resources faster than they can reproduce, then it's going to lead to population decline. A great example of overexploitation, well, not great, but overexploitation is really shown by what we're doing to the fish populations in the ocean, because the wild fish populations have been really tanking over time since humans have been overexploiting them for food.